So speakers, thanks so much. Excellent presentations from both of you. I want to move on to just a couple of questions in the time that we have left. And both of you feel free to interject on your thoughts on the questions. But Todd, I want to go back to you real quick here on one of our attendees asking from your presentation, what methods do you use to assess whether or not a client's projections are aggressive? What are your thoughts on that?
I'd say there's two things that I try to do. Number one, I ask the question, especially for an established company, one, understand if they have hit their forecast historically. So if they've given me projections that I do think are aggressive, I will ask them, okay, last year, what was your budget? And then I can also see if they hit their budget or not. Ideally, I'd go back at least 2 or 3 years to see how good they are at forecasting. And then the second thing would be ask enough questions. So when you are asking questions about the forecast, don't stop on the first or second question, but to continue to probe and see what the assumptions are behind the projections. And by doing so, then you can sometimes get indications as to whether or not you should potentially increase the discount rate. Ideally, you'd want the client to go back and reforecast if you do think there's an assumption that doesn't make sense. But as a last resort, then you may need to adjust your discount rate to capture that aggressive forecast.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Chris, do you have thoughts on that before we go on?
No, I think that makes that makes sense, Todd. I mean, that's typically our approach as well, is sort of testing the reasonableness of the projections against what's happened. I mean, we'll often also test projections against sort of overall, industry-wide projections to see what's happening as well. But I think the approach you mentioned makes sense.
Chris, I want to ask you now, especially in light of the last couple of years, an attendee wanting to know, how would you say the COVID-19 pandemic affected valuation disputes? I know this could be a long question, but let's try to see if we can't get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think in our experience, we're seeing, frankly, just a bigger range of values, or a bigger difference between high and low valuations in disputed contexts. And I think that's primarily due to disagreements over, growth expectations and risks for during COVID and more so for afterwards. I mean, there are disagreements over what the world looks like going forward. And we're also seeing substantial differences, depending on the industries. I mean, I mentioned a valuation that we did for a cleaning services, supply company, whose revenues increased tenfold. But I mean, in the context of COVID, we've also done valuations and analyses for, restaurant holding companies, which have, had a very different outlook. So I think in general, it's been certainly a wrinkle that adds complexity and has resulted in a wider range of values.
Todd, do you have thoughts on that also?
Yeah, I tell you, I think Chris nailed it. I mean, I think those are the things that I would have mentioned too. It is very industry specific. And what was really shocking is that when the pandemic first hit, we increased our equity risk premium just based on the conditions and some analysis that we ran. But really, there were lots of companies and lots of industries that certainly fared better than what we would have thought. So it's very industry specific.